Hello and good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Centre for Geopolitics panel discussion entitled Reflections on 25 Years of Devolution, the UK Union Today. My name's Jack Liddall and I'm a PhD candidate and research assistant in the UK Union programme here at the Centre for Geopolitics. I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion this evening. Before I introduce you to our panel, just a few wee housekeeping notes. I wanted to make all attendees aware that this discussion is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube. We have an hour for the discussion with our panelists, and then there's a half an hour Q&A session afterwards. Attendees can write their questions in the Q&A function, but there's no chat function. I'll read out your questions to our panel when we get to that stage. So I'm delighted to introduce Claire Adamson, who's been an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament since 2011 and is currently the MSP for Motherwell and Wishaw. Claire's the convener of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee. Corwin Jones was a member of the Senedd, previously the Welsh National Assembly, from 1999 until 2021 and served as the First Minister of Wales and the leader of Welsh Labour from 2009 to 2018. George Eustace was the Conservative MP for Camborne and Redruth from 2010 until standing down at the election this year. He served as the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from February 2020 to September 2022. And last but certainly not least, I'm delighted that we're joined by our very own Mike Kenny, who is Professor of Public Policy here at the University of Cambridge and is the inaugural Director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. So the opening question that our panelists are going to tackle tonight is, has devolution achieved its aims? And I'm delighted that Claire is going to get the ball rolling.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Centre of Geopolitics at Cambridge for inviting me along this evening. I'm going to do a very politician thing right now with that question and say, well, whose aims are we talking about? Obviously, there were very many different views on what devolution would bring to Scotland. For Donald Dewar himself, it was an ambition, something he wanted quite passionately to deliver following an incredible constitutional convention around the whole area of devolution that involved civic society. For John Smith, former leader of the Labour Party, he thought it would kill Scottish nationalism, dead. For Scottish nationalists, we had a very, very vigorous and sometimes contentious debate about it. Some felt it was a trap that would be detrimental to our movement. For others, it was an opportunity to have more powers and to show and showcase what Scotland might do with those powers. So very different views about what people thought devolution was for. That being said, we've had an incredible journey in Scotland, I believe. Certainly, far from killing Scottish nationalism, we saw the independence referendum in 2012. We have seen more powers. I think John Smith said also it was the settled will of the Scottish people. Well, that obviously wasn't the case, and the Smith Convention brought further powers to Scotland, which increased our ability to legislate on areas that hitherto had always been at Westminster. So it's, in a lot of ways, it has delivered a differentiation in opportunity. But of course, what has really changed everything was the Brexit vote. Which with the Internal Market Act and other areas has caused a huge challenge for devolved nations in terms of legislation, as the Internal Market Act, it acts like a trump card against most of what we want to do. But Brexit has also brought, I think, some strengthening of the relationships amongst the devolved nations of the UK, and we have seen what was the Brexit Interparliamentary Forum, which was a meeting of the Senedd, the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly, House of Lords and House of Commons. And that has continued as the IPF, where we're actually discussing the challenges of devolution and delivery and divergence in standards and legislation with our colleagues, which hadn't really happened in a significant way beforehand. So I'm very interested to see how all of these things develop, especially now for my first time we have the same government in Westminster as we do in one of those devolved nations in the Senate. So I'm looking forward to seeing how things develop. Thank you.
And over to Carwyn.
Thanks, Jack. Well, I'm not going to concentrate as much on policy as on the institution itself. I don't want to turn it into a party political debate. That's for another time. But what devolution has done for Wales is to give a nation a voice. I used the phrase an old nation had come of age in 2011 when we got lawmaking powers for the first time in 800 years. That was the last time a Welsh Parliament had sat. And let's remember the situation before devolution. Wales was governed by a vast bureaucracy. The Welsh Office, it was effectively a department run from London. Quite often it was staffed by a Secretary of State who had no connection at all with Wales. Nobody in Wales literally had voted for some of the people. We had John Redwood was Secretary of State, to remember that. Well, that clearly was an outrage in terms of democracy. So one of the things that happened is that the Welsh Office, as it were, was democratised through devolution. And since then we've seen devolution in Wales grow in popularity, grow in power. It's now a lawmaking, tax-raising parliament, something which I would never have imagined in '99 when I was first elected. And it's given people confidence in Wales. For a long, long time, there was a lack of confidence that we could do anything, that somehow we were genetically programmed to fail in everything that we did. And here we have a parliament and a government. Yes, it makes mistakes. So does Westminster, for that matter. All governments make mistakes. All parliaments make mistakes. But the point is, the people who we have in Cardiff are directly accountable to the people of Wales. Yes, there are some areas they wouldn't want to see devolved, of course not. Defence, one of them. The border and immigration, another one. That makes sense to me to be dealt with at a UK level. And of course, more than 50 Acts of Parliament have been passed. I only refer to one. I'm not going to go through all of them, you'd be relieved to know, and that's the Human Transplantation Act, which after a lot of intense and sensible debate saw the law on deemed consent change in Wales, so that people have to opt out if they want to be organ donors rather than opt in. And that's meant that there are organs available not just for people in Wales but across the UK, and that means there are people literally walking the streets alive today as a result of that legislation. There are still some issues that have to be resolved. Funding is an issue. I'm not going to start a battle about Barnet. I'll simply ask the question, can Barnet last forever? Question mark. I won't go further than that. There needs to be more transparency in terms of the way funding is distributed around the UK. The Treasury is a law unto itself. I've had to deal with that. For example, we in Wales have not had a consequential when it comes to HS2 because it goes as far as Birmingham, and that's close enough to Wales, apparently, for that not to happen. Well, that clearly it doesn't make sense. There has to be a way of holding the Treasury to account in a way that certainly I haven't seen in the past. And there's certainly more work to do in terms of improving intergovernmental relations and the institutions that govern those relations. And I know probably we'll come on to discussing that as we move forward this evening. Thanks, Jack.
Fantastic. And George, having been in the UK government, from your perspective, do you think that devolution has achieved its aims?
Yes, I think broadly it has achieved its aims, actually. I think there were some consequential things that needed to be done, such as resolving what was called the West Lothian question. And so I think the introduction of English votes for English laws in the Westminster Parliament dealt with that actually in probably quite a sensible way. I think it's important to recognise that what we have in this country is a devolution settlement, and it's not a federal system. And I remember having these discussions with the late Nigel Smith, who I knew very well. He was chairman of the pro-devolution campaign in Scotland, but was actually a Scottish unionist and opposed full independence. And his view was that you couldn't make a federal system work in the UK because simply England was too big. And for a federal system to work, it can work in places like the EU or even the United States, where you've got multiple states, most of which are similar size. If you've got a small number of states and one of them is much bigger than the others, you can't really establish a kind of workable qualified majority vote. And what that means is we've either got things that are, when push comes to shove, reserved to the UK government, or they're devolved. and we can try to work together in some areas, and we do, and we must. But basically, when it comes down to it, it falls into one of those two categories. I think what that means is that there has, in my mind, been, that the system's much more dependent than perhaps we would have thought on the political cycles. So I'll give you an example. Under the last Labour government, a convention was developed that when we did the December Fisheries Council for the UK around the table of the European Union, there'd be a delegation from every single administration in the UK. Now, at the time, most of those administrations were Labour administrations, and they could all get along quite well. By the time I arrived as Fisheries Minister in 2013, there was an SNP government in Scotland, a Labour government in Wales, a Conservative government, in England, or a coalition government, and it was Sinn Féin who held the brief and the portfolio in Northern Ireland. And that just made it a much more challenging thing to try to reach a UK-wide consensus in some of those international discussions. And I think the other thing I'd say is, like Claire, I think that Brexit has put quite a stress on the settlement that we have and on the union, just because of those different perspectives that there were on that issue. I hope that we're through that now, and if we can survive that, we can pretty much, I think, survive anything. But there was a bit of a paradox in that, on one level, when Tony Blair came up with the sort of devolution settlement way back in the late 90s, there were lots and lots of powers given to the devolved administrations, other parts of the UK, that maybe didn't mean that much, because most policy was being drafted in Brussels anyway. And it was really just a question of implementing them. And there was quite a challenge, I think, aside from the political differences, once you left the European Union, the devolved powers, certainly in DEFRA spaces, on things like the environment and on agriculture policy, they became very, very real and very stark. And it meant that you can have quite a divergence, in theory, between different parts of the UK. And I think that's, that's something that it remains to be seen whether we can live with that, or whether we do need something that kind of coordinates things a bit better. And then I think finally linked to something that Carwyn said, I do think that there's potentially a problem that Westminster departments feel that they're just dealing with England only on those devolved areas, and that leaves the devolved administrations on their own to have debates and arguments with the Treasury. And sometimes in these things, it felt a bit like the Treasury might be a common enemy for all the administrations in some ways, because you were trying to get them to understand certain things. And I felt very much in DEFRA that it would have been beneficial to Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland if actually a lot of that policy was filtered through the prism of DEFRA, so that DEFRA could help fight their corner in some ways within Whitehall, rather than leaving them to fight their own battles against the Treasury. But it is the case that the Treasury always preferred to leave DEFRA as England only, and deal directly with the devolves on their own budget issues. And I think there's something there that we probably need to address to make it work in future.
Fantastic. And then over to Mike to kind of finish on the opening statements.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, just picking up Claire's initial point about whose aims are we talking about. I did some work recently which sort of involved going back to look at the origins of devolution and the political debates about them as part of a book about the history of it since the millennium. And I was really struck, even if you just look at the Labour Party in the late 1990s, all sorts of different perspectives and hopes and some fears about devolution. I think if you focus just particularly on the sort of key architects of it within British government, as I was doing, then obviously Tony Blair was absolutely key, and I was very struck how much time he himself committed to getting involved in some of the more detailed debates about particularly the Scottish legislation. And that was in part because, of course, for him, this was a very difficult issue. This was really a mandate that he had inherited from his predecessor, John Smith. And of course, it was under Smith that there was more consensus began to emerge across the Labour family in favour of devolution. Don't there were still people who were sceptical. But of course, in the previous generation, this had been an immensely divisive issue back into the 1970s. So this was a bit of a hot potato when Blair took it on. But at the same time, he and others clearly believed that these reforms were needed in order to put the UK Union on a more stable footing. And that was primarily, I think, in relation to the mobilisation in Scotland after years of English Conservative government, as was then perceived. But I think what was also interesting about Blair is what he also did was actually manage some of the more radical ideas about what devolution might mean, and in some ways put a lid on those coming out of the Scottish Constitutional Convention and that stream of thinking. So devolution was presented as both a reform but also as continuity. It was part of a wider programme of modernisation, which was the buzzword then, and was essentially framed as a bolt-on to the existing structures and institutions of British government and the British constitutional tradition. Now, that was actually, I think, a very clever piece of politics, political rhetoric, but in some ways, I think, created a sort of ambiguity about the exact constitutional standing of the devolved institutions, which has in a way continued to play out, and we've seen as being the basis of conflict more recently. I think it's worth thinking, had devolution not been introduced, what would have happened as a sort of counterfactual. And it does seem to me that actually the forces that have brought nationalism in different parts of the UK to the fore would have done so. That would have happened. But I think there would have been a question mark about whether the older system, which Carwyn just described there in the context of Wales, whether that could have withstood those pressures, I think is a very interesting question to think about. One aim, I think, that wasn't delivered, if you look back as I did at the debates, the sort of things people said, certainly in Westminster, about what they hoped devolution would bring, I was quite struck about that there were, for some people, this idea that this would be a sort of policy laboratory, that we'd get lots of different approaches in terms of public policy that would actually spark off a sort of some mutual learning and drive standards up across the different governments in the UK. And whilst there have been some policy divergences and differences and notable achievements in different, certainly in Scotland and Wales, and then differently in Northern Ireland, I mean, there hasn't been that kind of takeoff of that idea that there's a sort of wish to learn from what others are doing. In fact, we've seen policy differences usually sort of weaponized around party differences. And I think in many ways, there are different obstacles to the sort of realization of that bit of the promise of devolution. I still think we've got a long way to go to try to ensure that there is a better, more mature debate about public policy. One step in the right direction, which the last government began under the last UK government, talking to its counterparts, was to try to ensure that there is comparability of data, which has always been a huge obstacle, I think, to actually having sort of proper conversation and comparison about policies and outcomes across the different parts of this system. And then just to finish very quickly, Jack, and perhaps a quick word on Northern Ireland, which hasn't really come up yet. If only to say that devolution in Northern Ireland in this period is a completely different story altogether. As you know, it emerges as a fundamental element within the peace deal, which is negotiated, overseen by the British and Irish governments and based on an international agreement, and which has at its heart this assembly with new political rules designed to find or to draw in the participation, find consensus between the two main communities. And there's this other complicated set of interlocking institutions around that. Now, in terms of aims, it seems to me that this has been strikingly successful in delivering on the core aim of establishing peace and drawing the main parties there into these political structures and away from violence. But there is a paradox there, which is that those new structures, which were devised around the need to bring the two communities together, were configured in a way that actually creates, in some ways, the conditions for continuing political instability because of the ability of the larger parties had to capsize the assembly. So the journey there, like in the other parts of the UK, I think, continues. You know, it is a cliche that devolution has turned out to be a process, not an event. And I think that's been true actually in every part of the UK where it's been introduced.
Fantastic. So many themes cropped up there in those opening statements. Let's try to work through them. The first one really that I want to talk about, Claire kind of hinted at in asking whose aims were we talking about. And if we just go back and focus on those early years of devolution and even before that with the campaign for devolution across the UK, perhaps devolution had a bit of a shaky start. I mean, Carwyn hinted at kind of low levels of confidence in Wales in the early noughties. Mike, spoke about the Labour Party and how there were all sorts of hopes and fears, I think was the phrase you used. And then Claire about, the development even within your own party about whether devolution was a trap or an opportunity. So I wonder if maybe we come to Carwyn first in Wales, this idea of confidence. If you can cast your mind back to the late 90s, I mean, what were people saying? Were they scared, worried, excited?
Well, the first thing to remember is that Wales is not Scotland. It's never been a state. The last Welsh banknotes were printed in 1908. It doesn't have that the idea of statehood that exists as a folk memory. Perhaps in Scotland, the idea Scotland joined the UK through a treaty. It wasn't a conquered nation. And there's a saying in Welsh, in the Welsh language, Gilyn Cymro yw Cymro. It's expressed in the masculine, and it says a Welshman's enemy is another Welshman. And Wales's history is full of warring principalities that shared a common language but loved to fight each other. And I'm afraid there was an element of that in the 90s at the time of devolution. We hadn't had a constitutional convention. There'd been none of the preparation that had happened in Scotland. People were suspicious of each other. The language divide, well, it'll be for Welsh speakers, or Welsh speakers saying the English speakers will try and lord it over us, and north versus south and valleys versus the cities. All that was still there. And it caused a lot of people to vote against the idea because of the fear of what might happen if people up the road got the levers of power. They saw it as better to have London doing it than the people in Swansea or people in Cardiff or people in Merthyr. It was quite strange, but it was still there. Also, people said, well, do we need it now? We've just had a Labour government with a big majority. Do we really need this now because we kind of got what we wanted? Do we need this extra institution? And people struggled with the idea of what an assembly was. I mean, people understood what a parliament was, but believe me, I had people asking me, what's an assembly? Is it like school assembly except in Welsh? I mean, odd, but this is what we were hearing on the doorstep. And in the end, it passed. But eerily, and I'll finish on this point, eerily, if you look at the map of Wales in 1999 and which areas voted no and yes, it looks very much like Wales in the 12th century, where you've got the Norman areas of the lowlands and the Welsh areas of the uplands. And it was reflected all those hundreds of years on in the result of that vote. It's changed since then, but it does show you how the echoes of history can affect the vote that takes place many hundreds of years later.
What about in Scotland, Claire? I mean, even if you were to just talk about the SNP and, this idea of a trap versus an opportunity, when did it go from folks thinking about devolution as one and not the other?
I think it was a sense of reality about the vote. I campaigned for the yes vote. It wasn't, many of my colleagues in the SNP didn't, but, I was one of the people who really wanted the devolved parliament. But I think George Reid, who went on to be presiding officer of the parliament, summed it up when he said after the vote, well, we're all gradualists now. So it's a sense of reality is that, the political reality of the UK had changed and that we had to move with that to make ourselves relevant because, that was just the reality. But there's also I think a sense of, I think we'd be having a quite different conversation had the northern regions of England voted for devolution as well, or a measure of devolution. I think the fact that we're bounded by the nation of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that it kind of skews the debate around nationality and things. But I think in terms of what devolution was about, it was about being able to make policy relevant to the area, the economic circumstances and the values of where you were living. And that didn't necessarily tie exactly with what was happening elsewhere. We were coming from, it was what brought me to Scottish nationalism was the deindustrialisation in Scotland. Ravenscraig in my hometown was closed in 1992, and there was a real sense of a worry and a sense of doom about what the future of the country would be. And I felt a real galvanisation from all areas of Scotland around the Parliament opening and the hope that that might make a real difference for people. And I think that still to a certain extent is held by most people.
And George, what about the Conservative camp in the 90s? How were folks wrestling with this idea of devolution? I don't know, perhaps you can give an insight from Cornwall as well. Were there views there?
Yes, well, obviously, coming from Cornwall, Carmen was talking about history, but way back in history, Cornwall was called West Wales because there's always been strong connections actually between Cornwall and Wales. And in fact, there's a small nationalist party in Cornwall called Mebion Kerno that works quite closely with Plaid Cymru to this day. And way before we had the convention that future monarchs should be Prince of Wales first, it became a constitutional rule that monarchs should be the Duchy or Duke of Cornwall first. So there are a lot of similarities there. And I always understood that. I used to call it's Cornwall. It's not really the nationalism. There's not a serious thing. It's quite a unionist part of the UK, but there is a Cornish particularism. And I think what I particularly, always understood during my time is this sense that, London doesn't get it. We're a long way away. We get forgotten. Our issues don't weigh heavily enough and don't prioritize enough. And I think that's however much countries might feel they've got a history that is one of independence. Those Celtic parts of the UK are all quite consistent in having that feeling and that sentiment. So I always understood that. I think within the Conservative Party, look, it was a difficult time as they were trundling towards the 97 defeat and had become quite unpopular in both Wales and in Scotland. And I think there were probably, evolved after that and immediately after the election, three kind of...
Have we lost George there? Yes, I can't hear you at the moment, George. We'll maybe come back to you on the point about the Conservative Party in the late 90s, and we'll go to Mike to maybe talk a bit about the view from England.
Sure. I was living in Sheffield at the time when the legislation was passed, and I was actually very struck by two things really. One was the sort of immense sense of sort of apathy and disconnection really from them in northern England, or at least that part of northern England, but also the sort of elements, a little bit of sort of grumbling, a little bit of grievance that you didn't have to go far to detect about the sort of perception, which is quite an ingrained perception, I think, in parts of the sort of post-industrial north, because deindustrialization obviously had a huge impact there, about the feeling that somehow British government has forgotten about us, is not as focused on our needs as it is on other parts of the UK. I don't think that sentiment has ever sort of bubbled over into a kind of anti-devolution movement in England. And I think for the most part, as I say, apathy is probably the main sort of sentiment towards these reforms. But I think it has been striking since then that there have been these occasional moments of where very intense sort of sensitivity and a bit of grievance about aspects of devolution or their consequences have broken out into British politics. You'll probably remember the votes during the second Blair government about I think it was reforms to the hospital foundation reforms and also tuition fees, which were bits of legislation that only applied in England that were carried on really with the support of Scottish MPs. There was a big reaction then, and then we saw that periodically these moments of response. I was very struck during the Scottish referendum, going around bits of England talking about that, just sort of, it seemed to me there had been a slight hardening of sentiment about, when are we going to get a vote? When do we get some sort of chance to articulate our views about how we want to be governed? And of course, by then, different parts of England, you can see it in the survey data, were becoming much more unhappy with the direction of travel of British government policy, and also with arguably with government from London and what that meant. So I think look, the way I put it is that I think, in a way, when devolution was introduced, I mean, I look back even to see how many English MPs for English seats spoke, and it was remarkably few. And that was very telling. This was sort of assumed to be a debate about the other peoples of the UK, other parts of it. So the English were sort of left as bystanders. But I think in different ways, that has ceased to be a sort of a confident, you can't be confident that that has remained the case. And quite what the English do want in governance terms, I think, is still being worked out in many ways. And the model of devolution, subnational devolution we've got, may partly be an answer to that. But I think there's devolution elsewhere has really raised quite a big and deep question about where the English sit within this new settlement, and I think we still wait to get a clear answer to that.
Yes, George, sorry, we cut you off. Hopefully we can hear you now. You were talking about the view from the Conservative camp in the late 90s.
Yes, no, apologies for that. Hopefully you can hear now. So I think there were sort of three strands of opinion. One were unionists who felt that this was the thin end of the wedge and it would become a source of further grievance and would become a further wedge that would split the union apart. There was then a very small strand, but it was there nonetheless of what we used to call Englishism. And these were people who kind of said, let them get on with it, see how they get on without us looking after them, kind of thing. That was quite a minority view, but it was there. And I think then the principal view was really one of reconciliation with what had been done. They might have not done it themselves, but I think really under David Cameron in particular, but to be fair, his predecessors as well, they very much took the view that we should embrace devolution as a party. It was here to stay. Whatever reservations people might have had, the most important thing was for the Conservative Party to find its voice again in every part of the UK and reconnect, with Wales and Scotland, where it basically lost touch with people during the 1990s. And I think that became the overriding mission for David Cameron in particular. And so at that point, they really, embraced the devolution principle. And in fact, even started to moot certain things like should the Conservative Party in Scotland just become, fully independent of the Conservative Party, and actually stand as an independent centre-right party in Scotland with its own, very authentic identity rather than being part of the UK-wide Conservatives. Those sorts of conversations were being had by around 2005.
Fantastic. We'll maybe move on to the issue of English devolution, just because several of the panelists have raised it, including Claire, which was very interesting. You were nodding when Mike was talking about devolution in the north of England, and you mentioned the referendum in the northeast of England as well, the very early years of devolution. What would the implications be for the rest of the UK, particularly Scotland, if we saw some kind of enhanced English devolution? And just for you, from a kind of SNP viewpoint, how much are you invested in devolution in England?
I think not from a sort of party political point of view, but I think I would support further devolution of powers to the areas where they are looking after. And you look at the mayoral system has been a slight move towards that direction. But our committee did a number of pieces of reports around how has devolution changed, what impact Brexit has had, and we spoke a lot about and we also did one on the Internal Market Act, and we spoke to a lot of former senior civil servants from various times since devolution in government, both from the United Kingdom and from Scotland and from Wales. And there was a feeling that while Westminster itself legislates for both England and the rest of the country in certain areas, there was always going to be this stress around where its priorities would be. And I think we still see that happening. And also that, you know, a sort of fair position would be if England was devolved as a whole or in parts too, to be able to take control of some of the areas that we have. So I'm not averse to it, but I think that the feeling, and certainly we've had views from other academics that, you know, it should be a devolved nation in itself. So we've got this ancient system at Westminster, Henry VIII laws and all that kind of things that came out post-Brexit, which is under strain, I think, because it's always worked on convention, and convention is fine while it works. But what we've seen certainly post-Brexit is where the sole convention, I think, had been breached on maybe 6 occasions in 20-odd years. Now it's a regular occurrence, and there's been consensus, not just with the Scottish Parliament and our committees, about how that affects scrutiny and openness around legislation that is devolved. But that's been raised also by the Welsh Senate and the House of Lords, indeed, about how do you have parliamentary scrutiny if things are going to be done through common frameworks, behind closed doors, officials only. It leaves a question around the current devolution settlement for the countries that were there, but also how does that evolve in the future while Westminster still has that kind of overall control and trump card of what happens.
Yeah. And George, you've spoken about how often it seems as though UK government departments just operate as England-only organisations, but then also on the other hand, there's this problem, as you see it, of federalism. So, I mean, you've hinted at it in a few ways, but what would you do? What should we do? This is almost hinting at a later question I have about, how should the devolved system evolve in the future? But is there a solution?
Well, I think it's difficult without going to a federal system, which I don't think can really work, unless you did really undermine the Westminster Parliament and then just have lots of regional assemblies, which perhaps was part of the sort of model originally, but it was one that was quite roundly rejected. I think it's important to note here that the glue that's kept the union together in some ways is the fact that we have one civil service, and this isn't always understood, but the civil servants that work for people like me previously in DEFRA and in Whitehall departments, they're all part of the same civil service that work for the Scottish government and Welsh government and so on. Northern Ireland's a bit different, but what it means is it operates as a cohesive whole. And when there are, frankly, political tensions, because politics is what it is, and different administrations will take different views, and if there are elections quite close, we'll sometimes try and score points off one another. It's just the reality of politics. Actually, I used to find it quite often civil servants would be very important to try and work behind the scenes with their counterparts in the devolved administrations to try and choreograph a landing zone that everyone could be happy with. And, I knew what was going on, and we used to let that happen. And sometimes they would probably say things that they wouldn't properly admit to me. And sometimes their officials might do the same with their own ministers. But I think it's really important to understand the role that the civil service play to keep the union together, because they do act as a single civil service at the end of the day. And I think there are some remaining anomalies as a result of basically the devolution settlement we have, and then the powers coming back after Brexit. And so just in the DEFRA space, there are issues like pesticides regulation, whereby convention that is done UK-wide, although it's technically devolved. And that's because Wales and Scotland haven't got the capacity to have very detailed chemical experts and pesticide experts. So it's agreed that that's done UK-wide, even though it's technically devolved. And on fisheries, these are agreed as a reserved power by the UK, but individual licenses are technically issued by the devolved administrations, even though they have no power not to issue a license to foreign vessels. And so there's quite a few anomalies like that I think could be tidied up, frankly, in a post-Brexit world. But fundamentally, I'm quite optimistic, because I think the paradox is that some of the nationalist parties were quite stridently opposed to leaving the UK. But the paradox is that their devolution powers become real now that we have left, sorry, it's leaving the EU, but now we've left the EU. Those powers of devolution do become real. They can be exercised in a way that they frankly couldn't while we were in the European Union, because things were decided collectively at an EU level. So I think that over time, once the the animosity of that Brexit debate finally recedes, we will be in a new space where actually the devolved administrations will find they've got more power than they've ever had before, and they'll start to learn to use those powers to the benefit of their people. And I personally think that that will therefore strengthen the UK as a whole and strengthen the devolution settlement we have.
Great. I will specifically ask a question on Brexit. It keeps cropping up here. But I did want to ask Corwin first, when you were First Minister. Firstly, George makes a point there about there being one civil service. I mean, did you find when you were First Minister that could have an ameliorating effect when there were perhaps fractious intergovernmental relations? That was one question. But the other one was that your government, of course, had various recommendations about how to improve intergovernmental relations, but also, the kind of constitutional arrangements more generally. What about English devolution specifically? And then I suppose we're already getting into that question about the future. So there's several questions there, but I don't know if you had some thoughts.
Well, the English question is the most difficult question of all, because George has said it, England is so big. England is, 80% plus of the population of the UK. It's not like the States where you've got, California and Rhode Island, but there's not one massive state that is effectively 4/5 of the population. And that creates a challenge. Can you have a completely federal Britain? Unlikely. First of all, you need a written constitution, which is anathema in the British system. In the British constitution is basically, there is a monarch and two houses of parliament, and that's it. Pretty much the rest of it is convention. It relies on sensible people understanding the guardrails, and that is where we are. So I don't think we're going to see that happen. That would require a written constitution. It would mean redefining parliamentary sovereignty, if not ending it in some way. And all these things are very big questions that no one's going to win an election saying we're going to have a written constitution. So I think we can park that. So what do we do in the meantime? There are different models you can adopt. You could say, for example, well, we'll have 4 devolved nations. England will be one, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but then England is so big. Or you can just be practical about it. Our devolution settlements are asymmetric. If you look at Spain, it's a similar system there. There are different regions in Spain. They don't all have the same powers. For example, if someone said to me, would I want the powers that Northern Ireland had over employment legislation? I'd say, well, no, because I think that should be as common as it possibly can be across Europe, quite frankly. We wouldn't want Welsh employment law. And I think that pragmatism is reflected in the way that we've seen the combined authorities in England, mayoralties in England with different powers, the London Assembly and Mayor, completely different model again. And I think it's a question really of, yes, I think devolution is a good thing. Devolving powers away from London is a good thing. The UK is very centralised, but I don't think it needs to be done as an identical package across the whole of the UK. So I think in England, you can be pragmatic. You can look at different parts of England, see what works in different parts of England. I think that provides you with it's not a perfect solution, but some way of resolving the English question.
And what about this idea of the one civil service? I mean, folks, when asked about it, ministers, they do point to that as being a positive. And for you, do you just have some kind of stories about that?
I think there are back channels. I think it's important that there are those back channels between civil servants who are perhaps talking to each other in a calmer way than their ministers might in times of political frisson, we call it that way. I don't think the civil service is as cohesive as it was actually across GB. I think there's far less of a tendency now for people to move across borders than there used to be. The Welsh office tended to be a place where people came to retire the days before devolution. We now have, I've seen it, much more dynamic, younger civil servants who are coming into the civil service in Wales. And I think it's getting the balance right. What we don't want is to create an entirely self-contained civil service in Wales that has no links and therefore learns no lessons from the civil service elsewhere in GB. It's important that we are able to learn from each other. It's important our civil servants learn from each other. It is important that civil servants do work in other parts of the UK and work, for that matter, in local government to get some, and in the private sector to get some experience there. So it is advantageous, but I think practically you are now seeing the three different civil services, and you can't really call that, England's so big, you can't really call it the English civil service, becoming more self-contained than they were. And there are advantages to that, but you have to make sure the disadvantages where those connections that once existed are not lost.
Fantastic. And then on that English devolution question, Mike, you've heard from the politicians or ex-politicians on that, and it's over to you with your academic perspective.
Well, I mean, just a very quick point, if I can, just on the civil service debate, because that is really interesting to hear those perspectives. It's one of the things. So in the book I wrote, this isn't just a shameless plug, but it's a bit of that. But I did actually look at how the UK civil service worked with its Whitehall worked with its counterparts elsewhere, particularly during Brexit and then COVID. And I was struck by how important those interactions and networks, a lot of them informal and bilateral connections, were. Some of them became more formalized, of course, as George will remember, at points during the Brexit process, particularly in preparations around when no deal looked like it was a possibility. And I think, again, in COVID even more. I mean, I think this idea that at the political level, sometimes there have been storms and great conflicts, but actually, administratively, I'm not saying everything's been hunky-dory, and I do recognise Carwyn's picture about greater differentiation across GB. I think that is right. But also there have been some very interesting sort of unseen or invisible sort of points of connections that have kept the administrative show on the road and have been very important. On English devolution, I guess, I mean, the way I sort of come into this is to say, I think one of the things that's difficult here is that the governance of England has become really complicated and messy and opaque. And that is for different reasons. At the sort of top, I think it begins with the points that people have been talking about, the fact that Whitehall or the domestic departments of Whitehall are predominantly managing England, but they don't say that. And there's a sort of element of confusion, I think, built in there now. Then I think you go down the layers, and English local government is particularly complicated. You've also got the way in which public services are delivered in England across a whole set of variable geometries. You've got a system of devolution that is, of course, half built at the moment, and it may be that we see much more of that map being filled in with the English devolution white paper that's coming down the track, I think next week, actually, so we'll see. But, one of the things, and you can pick this up in polling in England, that people find their governance really frustrating. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that there's a mass demand for national level devolution, but I do think that the governance questions are really problematic, are particularly problematic in England. And I think any sort of discussion of English devolution really has to sort of start from that point. So if we do, broadly, I agree with Carwyn. I think that a pragmatic incrementalist approach, which began under the coalition government, 2010, and then carried on by the Conservative government and now picked up by Labour. There's a broad consensus about this city regional model, though what that's going to look like in places like the east of England, southwest of England is much harder. But there is a consensus there, but doing it piecemeal has its downsides. If we just sort of add layers of further governance, I think actually that's probably the wrong way to go. So it probably does mean trying to bite the bullet on local government reform, which is the thing that obviously successive governments have wanted to avoid doing. But I do think it's probably unavoidable in order to create something that is a bit more coherent. And if we are going to have effective and empowered combined authorities, we need to look, I think, at how local government within those areas works. The other final thing I'd say is, I mean, I do think at the moment we've got to also remember this is a completely different model of devolution. I mean, some people would say it's not even really devolution, what you've got in England. It's much more constrained. The other models, much more tied to the Treasury in terms of the funding position. And, essentially, except in a few areas, really most of the powers of mayors are performative. So we've still got quite a long way to go, I think, in terms of making this a sort of a meaningful model that will actually give local people a sense of greater control. That said, there are bright shoots. I think the Trailblazer model that the last government began to put together and this government will build on, does point towards a brighter future there.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's try and whiz through a final question on Brexit. I'll come to you first, Claire. The others also spoke about this kind of federal idea, so I wonder if you wanted to perhaps talk about that first. I mean, you presumably think federalism cannot work, but because independence is the best solution. So I suppose as someone who believes in Scottish independence, how do you engage with that idea of federalism? And then if you want to kind of start us off on the final question, which is really what were the strains that were placed on devolution by Brexit? I mean, you spoke there about how your committee has done those various inquiries and heard from civil servants. And so if you could give us insight into that, that would be fantastic.
Well, I guess if we go to the last part of that first, I think you were talking about asymmetric devolution. We do now have an asymmetric relationship across the UK with Europe, which doesn't help many of the situations that are causing worry for people. We have the situation of cross ferry connections to Northern Ireland. So it's their position in terms of trading goods has had an impact on our producers and exporters. So what we've seen is a really huge economic impact, particularly on our SMEs. And Scotland has more SMEs than other parts of the UK, which means that our businesses really feel detrimentally impacted by this. Many businesses have given up trying to import to Europe at all. And when the borders go up in both sides, and until there's pressure on importers from the EU, which have had no impact on them at all, there's not a willingness or an appetite for that to be fixed. But we do have, I suppose, an opportunity with the TCA review to put these things to them. I think in terms of federalism, I think I said I kind of laid it out. I think I'm a pragmatist about these things. I will, nothing in the last 40 odd years of my life had made me changed about where I am in terms, I grew up in a very traditional Labour area with, not members of the Labour Party, but trade unionist parents. And my view of independence is that I think we would just have an opportunity to have an independent and a very Scottish focused view, which is sometimes we don't get at the moment. And I think some of the devolution gains from Scotland from all political parties, Jack McConnell was the first one to get post-study work visa through. Unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. But you think of Labour colleague Monica Lennon and her bill on free period products in Scotland, a trailblazing area. I think there are things that we feel that we could take forward further. So I'll never stop thinking that, but there's others that do. But yeah, that aside, my reason for being in politics is to improve the lives of the people that I represent and try to make life better for them. And I think that goes for every politician. We may have different political views about it, but I think we have to be pragmatists in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. But I do think I was shocked about Brexit. I was a data scientist before I became a politician. I knew the independence vote was on a knife edge, but my heart hoped. I really didn't think we would get there that time. But looking at the same data in Scotland, I was utterly shocked the morning of Brexit, because maybe too insular in my own mind, I hadn't realised the strength of feeling elsewhere. But I think the longer term impacts of Brexit in terms of opportunities for business, for free movement of people, for our cultural industry, everything is going to just be something that absolutely completes the process of the move away back towards Europe being a driving force rather than Scottish independence as such. And the first part of your question was about the federalised. Oh, I think I answered that right. So I think I've covered most of it. Thank you.
You have. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll try and folks can just maybe speak for 1 or 2 minutes now, so I can let folks in the audience ask questions too. But I'll go to George next, because obviously being the DEFRA secretary during Brexit negotiations, can you just give us an insight into what that was like and the strain that that put on the devolved system or intergovernmental relations, or that perhaps it didn't, and maybe we over exaggerate?
No, I think there were tensions because, politically, at a political level, there were quite clear differences about the issue. And, it was a long, protracted debate that ran for several years. But I think there were a number of, my overall feeling is that in the long term, the devolution settlement will mean more than it's ever meant in history, having left the European Union, because those powers can now be exercised by the devolved administrations. And I think it'll be very difficult when people look at it to actually move back in the other direction, as I think the current Labour government's finding, because, as soon as you talk to the European Union about a more pragmatic, more sensible arrangement, well, they'll want money, they'll want more, free movement, which is, politically difficult. But in the case of Scotland, they'll want fish. So they'll want the fish back, and more access for fish. And, it's quite a challenging, I think, thing in reality for a Scottish government to do, to try to move back closer to the European Union. And, the sort of tensions we had were really around areas that needed, consensus opinion between the UK. And so we had some challenges, for instance, with Wales being unenthusiastic about building border control posts, and that taking time and taking longer than it had done in England. And then there being a general view, which was, well, you can't have control posts on one part of the UK and not the rest, so we better delay the whole thing. So there was a kind of lowest common denominator factor there. And because the Welsh government, for reasons they might well have had, were unenthusiastic about putting in place those border controls, that caused challenges. I think in Scotland, I remember there being debates, for instance, when we were trying to make some reforms to gene editing legislation, so-called precision breeding. The James Hutton Institute in Scotland was the UK's leading centre for that. They wanted us to do it, but the Scottish government took a very ideological view, which is they wanted to do it, but only after the European Union. So there was a very kind of a very strong view that they needed to remain in lockstep with the European Union, even when it was potentially against Scottish interests. And I'm not sure that, I think that position's starting to fray, and I'm sure it'll continue to, because I don't think that lasts long term. And I can also remember some issues around seed potatoes, big industry in Scotland. The UK had been trying to get the EU to accept Scottish and UK seed potatoes, which have got the highest health status in the world, in Ireland and the European Union. The EU refused to do that unless we aligned dynamically our regulations, and that was a red line for the UK, so we couldn't do that. But I know Scotland had said, yeah, sure, we will dynamically align, and then that probably, it undermined the agreement that we were close to landing for what we call static alignment, because you had Scotland saying that they would be willing to dynamically align, and that's what the EU really wanted. So I think it was difficult. I think in the end, we respected that there were, this was a big issue and there were genuine differences of opinion, but it was a very, very fraught time, to be honest, trying to do a very difficult negotiation with the European Union, while there was also, a wide spread of views being publicly expressed, between different parts of the UK as well. And that was quite challenging to try to keep a coherent UK position at the negotiating table.
Well, Carwyn, what was it like being Welsh First Minister during that period?
Well, Brexit has happened. In my house, there are 4 of us, and I'm the only one with an Irish passport. I'm not bitter about that, but I thought I'd mention that. I've tried, believe me. It was post-Brexit, really, where there were challenges. And it was to do with where should powers rest when they came back from Europe. There were some who took the view in Westminster, well, everything will come here first, and then we'll decide where those powers go. We took the view, well, no. If something is devolved and European, you take out the European and you're left with devolved. Now, as it happened, I sat down with David Liddington and we came to what I thought was a good agreement. My SNP colleagues couldn't accept it. I think it was more to do with not being able to accept anything that came from London, if I'm honest. It was no easier for me, of course, being a Labour First Minister dealing with a Conservative government. But David and I sat down, and we came to the agreement that whatever is devolved will be devolved. Whatever was going to come back to London anyway goes there. And then you had this third category, areas where you needed to have a certain amount of commonality across the UK: agriculture, fisheries. And we said, okay, those areas that really need agreement across the UK, we'll keep them as they are. And then when we're ready, we'll take them out of the cupboard and we'll all agree what things should look like. Because it's not in Wales's interest to have, for example, a free-for-all when it comes to agricultural support. If that happens, the country with the biggest amount of money wins, and that's not Wales. So it is in Wales's interest to have a flexible but common structure for agricultural support across the UK, and that's where we were. And I thought that was sensible. A coach and horses was driven through that by Boris Johnson, and the Internal Market Act and Subsidy Control Act were an example of that. I thought there was a huge opportunity that we missed here. We have the Joint Ministerial Council, which meets. It meets in plenary once a year and every quarter. It's meant to be a discussion amongst governments. It's basically a litany of complaints that are thrown at the UK government, and that's basically what it is. It could be a lot more than that. It could have been turned into a proper intergovernmental forum where decisions were taken, and I think that would have helped with the maturity of the process as well. It didn't happen. That JMC could have actually developed a set of rules for an internal British market, which is important. You don't want internal barriers in the UK if you can avoid it. But instead, it was the UK government that did it itself. And as a result, the buy-in isn't there. I know that my colleagues in the Welsh government are looking to find every imaginable way of picking holes in those two pieces of legislation because they've got no sense of buy-in. And that's a great tragedy. I thought where we started with David in those negotiations, we could have moved on to developing a common set of rules for the operation of the internal market of the UK that would have had buy-in across the UK. But unfortunately, that's not what happened.
Thank you. And then, Mike, do you want to wrap us up this discussion section of the evening on the kind of Brexit idea, or perhaps more broadly on just how, I mean, this is in your book, Fractured Union, for anyone that wants to read it, about just how well placed the union is to kind of deal with constitutional challenges. Or of course, we had COVID. We haven't spoken about that. Just how resilient is the union?
Yeah, I mean, it is. One way of seeing this is that if I think George articulated this earlier, if the union can survive the storms generated by Brexit, which generated these very difficult policy questions, which Carwyn's just been describing, and the conflicts which arose really from different approaches taken by successive British governments to them. But behind all that, Brexit was an immense challenge because it forced to the surface, the question of sovereignty in a very direct and kind of binary way in those areas, but in others too, obviously around issues around the Sewell Convention and the principle of legislative consent, which had been sewn into the devolution agreement. So, Brexit was an immense challenge, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And it was a challenge. It was always going to be a challenge because of the territorial nature of the result. I mean, so that was always going to be difficult. I think, we've heard about some of the differences in the conflicts. I think, in the book, what I was trying to look at was how did different parts of British government respond to that, as much behind the scenes as in terms of the kind of front of house political positions. And I mean, a couple of things struck me that might be relevant to the question about sustainability. One is that I was struck actually about how variable across Whitehall there is in terms of an understanding of devolution and a sort of history of dealing with the devolved administrations. I mean, DEFRA, which is the department that George has been describing, I think has a very good track record overall and compares very well with some other UK departments. So there's a variability there. And I think one of the things that Brexit has forced to the surface, which is linked to the longer term question about how to keep the UK together, is about the quality of governance at the centre, about how well is devolution sort of understood and factored into the way in which different government departments operate, into indeed the culture of Whitehall and Westminster as well. So I think there's there's some lessons that can be drawn there. I mean, look, I think ultimately the future of the UK is affected by all sorts of different things, both things that are outside of our control as a country, to do with economic shocks, to do with geopolitical challenges, but also to think about what are the sources of strength and resilience internally. And I think ultimately it's really drawing up what different people have said, it's actually having a kind of pragmatic approach to governance, being able to understand that really this system we've got is actually about relationships, and it's about managing those well and investing in them. And that means there has to be a bit of give and take. And the UK government is the government for the whole of the territorial part of the UK, and it has to give as well as take. And I think to find a kind of space which is somewhere between a sort of command and control on the one hand, and then a kind of, okay, we've devolved, then we'll leave you alone on the other hand, I think there's a big space between there for evolving a more mature set of relationships. And I'll just close this point on the intergovernmental point. To pick up Carwyn's story, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. JMC at that point was not fit for purpose. But it is interesting that during those years, as you know, behind the scenes, these negotiations were going on across the different governments to devise a new intergovernmental relations settlement. That was then agreed in 22. I mean, it's early days. We've had a change of government at the centre, but I think, that to have a more systematic way of bringing the governments together at different levels seems to me that's a part of the process that needs to be undertaken going forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for a very exciting past hour and 10 minutes. We've covered a lot there. I'd encourage our audience, our attendees there, to start submitting questions into the Q&A. We have a few in there already, and so I'll maybe fire them at the folks that I think they're most directed towards, but anyone please weigh in at any point. We have a question on the Barnett formula. Specifically, we don't need to get too het up with it, but Carwyn did mention it earlier on, and this question is saying that Joe Barnett himself was surprised that the Barnett formula had persisted, that it remained, and is asking how would you reform it? I don't know if you have any ideas about that, Carwyn.
Well, I'm going to be diplomatic and say if I was Scottish, I'd want to keep it. Unfortunately, if you look at Wales, we could do better under a different formula. There's no question about that. I'm not saying Scotland, give us all your money. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying from a Welsh perspective, we do better than the English regions, no question about that. Northern Ireland does very well, but any formula at some point has to be reformed. Of course, there has to be a way of making sure that you don't see huge changes in funding. I think if you're looking to change a funding formula, you do it after several years of funding growth, not when there are cuts. I think that's important as well. But yeah, I mean, a formula can't stay in place forever and a day. There has to be a review at some point. But I think that review is probably some way off.
I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on the Barnett formula debate, or we have, George.
Well, Jack, I might just say, having looked at a number of formulas in DEFRA, including the allocation of the agricultural budget between the UK, but also allocation of fishing quotas, it's surprisingly difficult to change these things. They have a tendency to get set in concrete once they're set. And that's because when we looked at different methodologies on agriculture, we looked at land classifications, we looked at average size of holdings, we looked at all sorts of different criteria, and there were always winners and losers. And so if you did something that would benefit Wales or Scotland, Northern Ireland was a big loser, and vice versa. It is a zero-sum game. And that is why in the end, you tend, I'm afraid, for a quiet life to settle for sticking with what you've got with maybe one or two tweaks, because to sort of turn it all on its end is quite tricky to achieve. And so I can entirely understand why the Barnett formulas remain stuck there. I should say that there was a moment when the Treasury, when I was in DEFRA, wanted to, as they call it, Barnettize the agriculture budget, which would have been disastrous for the devolved administrations, I think particularly Wales. So DEFRA, had to sort of see that one off and fight that off and say that we should stick with the historic allocations that we'd had through the Common Agricultural Policy. So it's complex always, and I understand why it ends up being left.
Fantastic. We also had a question about so English devolution, but in particular, we've obviously spoken about the asymmetry in the UK in terms of population size, but this question is asking about if we were to break up England into its various regions, the implications of that kind of system. Mike, I'm sure you have your opinions on doing that. What would be the implications if we were to do that?
Well, I mean, it's not entirely hypothetical. It's not that far from the model that New Labour was sort of evolving, led by John Prescott. And of course, the first test of that, the popular test of that, was the Northeast, the referendum in the Northeast, which was lost pretty spectacularly. And I mean, I think behind that, there is, I think it goes, there's some complex questions here about identity. I mean, if you build a system of government with borders that people just don't really recognise or feel any kind of link to, or affiliation with, I think it's very hard to justify, to sell to people. And I think it was hard then, and I think it's probably 5 times as hard now, given the sort of decline of trust in politics and government that's happened since. I think that's almost a non-starter. I mean, obviously at that time it was also linked to the European question as well, and the sort of perception that this was somehow this sort of Europe of the regions project, which I think was mostly inaccurate. But I mean, that did not help the cause of those making this argument. But I think what we've I think what's happened since, the sort of focus on a slightly what is a very different geography actually, which is sort of big conurbations and their hinterland regions, I think that makes a lot more sense actually in functional terms, particularly if you are trying to think about sort of economic growth and travel to work areas and so on. I think the central government's been right to push more in that direction. The problem is there you also do butt against some difficult issues around geography and place and how linked people feel to those institutions. But it seems to me that there's more likelihood that a model which has Greater Manchester, say, having its own sort of administration is much more likely to prosper than the northwest region of England. I think the chances of that kind of model working are very slim. And I think actually it's been quite significant that in the Labour Party, this idea has quietly pretty much disappeared.
Anyone else want to come in? Or I have yes, to Claire. I mean, I was actually going to ask you, Claire, as well. There's obviously the Council of Nations and Regions, and John Swinney's been going to that. I suppose from your perspective and within your party, this idea of the First Minister of Scotland going to this council, how do you feel about that?
So again, it was not without its controversy, certainly. I mean, the independence movement is a much wider, bigger group than just the SNP as well. But I think it's down to pragmatism as well. I mean, you don't, take your ball away from the game and don't play, I mean, if this is what's happening and what's been presented, then I think you have to do your best to represent your country and represent where you want to be with it. And I think we've had some successes in terms of relationship building post the start of it. So they think of the negotiations around the fiscal framework that the Scottish Government were involved in. That was a very successful negotiation between ourselves and Westminster. But at the end of the day, I'm a Democrat more than anything, and I think the devolution of any kind in England is going to have to come from the people. They're going to have to want it and vote for it, and for there to be a willingness to go down that route amongst themselves. But I don't know that has grown in any way. But I do think you're then left with it. I think Mike mentioned it earlier on, a sort of looking over the border at some of the advantages that devolution has brought to Wales and Scotland with a bit of envy. But I think there has to be a realisation that, if the opportunities presented that might be a route to addressing some of that feeling about it. But it's up to the people of England, you know, it's up to the domiciled people in England to say, well, it's time.
Great. I don't know if anyone has anything else they want to say on that question. Otherwise, there's more questions. We have one specifically on Northern Ireland and how the current devolution settlement for Northern Ireland is perhaps can be seen as being uncertain or unstable. This person talking about how the uncertainty comes from its relationship with or even within Ireland, the island of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. So how durable is the Northern Irish situation, the Northern Ireland devolution settlement? Mike, you've mentioned Northern Ireland. I'll maybe come back to you. Carwyn, your personal connections with Northern Ireland, and also there's many in the kind of Welsh circles that say that you were one of the first to spot the Irish border problem. So you know, what are you thinking?
Well, I've known Northern Ireland for more than 30 years. My wife's from Belfast, and I first went there in 1992, and it was a very different place then. It was an armed camp. There were roadblocks everywhere. There was a helicopter in the air hovering all day above Belfast. To see it now is incredible. You know, let's not underestimate the progress that's come following the Belfast to Good Friday Agreement. Everything has to have two names in Northern Ireland, like Derry stroke Londonderry. And anything that interferes with that has got to be resisted. Brexit was always going to be a massive problem in Northern Ireland. And you're right, I was talking about it, and people were saying, what are you on about? Britain's an island. It's not. It has a land border with the EU and will do. And that issue still isn't wholly resolved. Northern Ireland's unusual in the sense that Northern Ireland's governmental structure was set up at a time when there was a fear of domination by one community over another because of numbers. That's not there anymore. The numbers aren't there anymore, even if the fear is. There are more Catholics than Protestants in Northern Ireland now, but neither of those people who identify as such in those groups are in a majority. About 30% of the population of Northern Ireland now sees itself as having a Northern Irish identity. It's constitutionally neutral. If you look at the opinion polls, and if you look at the census, they're mainly younger people. They don't remember the troubles when you were basically on one side or the other. And they're the people who will determine the future of Northern Ireland. And to me, it then asks this question. I simply put it out there. Do you need a government structure where you have effectively an enforced coalition in Northern Ireland, because it's changed so much in terms of its numbers since 1998. Now, there will be people in Northern Ireland who will disagree strongly with what I've just said. Okay, they will say, no, it's needed. But that only works if you have the goodwill in the major parties to work together, even when they're diametrically opposed. That's happened sometimes. It's happening now. There have been occasions in the past where for years Northern Ireland's gone without a government. And I think the structure that's there at the moment of an enforced coalition, and that's what I call it, of representation from different sides of the community, that will have to prove that it works. It's no good having a system where one side or the other can collapse it on a regular basis. I think eventually people will say, well, hang on a second, things have got to change. And Northern Ireland has changed. Whether that will be reflected in terms of its governance in the future, we'll have to wait and see.
Great. Mike, I'll go to Claire first, and then we'll come back to Mike.
Yeah, it was just to see that we've been working, one of our committee advisors is actually Katie Hayward from Belfast University, and she's done a huge amount of work in tracking the change in attitudes of the population, almost reporting that very, very frequently, and it's very revealing to those civic changes that have happened. Our main concern, I would say, here in Scotland is the advantage that the situation has given in terms of that land border with Ireland and the opportunities that are there for Irish goods that and goods going into Europe that we don't have, which again is worry to our producers here.
Great. And then Mike, obviously, you've also got personal connections to Ireland, and I think you spent some time in Northern Ireland as well, if I remember correctly. But
yeah, no, I was living and working there. It turns out at the same time as Carwyn. Actually, I was there in the early 90s, and I totally agree with him. I mean, the place has just transformed almost entirely for the better, which is fantastic, actually. I think the only thing I'd add is that I was really struck. I still go back to Northern Ireland and talk to people there, and including to civil servants. And there was a really terrible time, a very difficult time there when the institutions had been collapsed. And if you remember, there was this, essentially it was ruled by civil servants. And of course, the Northern Irish Civil Service were very hamstrung in what they could do, were very reluctant, rightly, to take decisions that would be deemed to be political and to make decisions about funding and priorities. And the quality of public policy really declined notably at that time. So whilst I agree with Carwyn's point about this forced coalition model does look like it's running out of road, it's better than that. It's at least better to have the institutions up and running. But I think the longer term problem is that what Brexit there locally has accelerated something that was sort of happening anyway, which is the fragmentation of unionist politics. And it's really the impact it's had within the different political communities of unionism, the pressure that the DUP have come under, the emergence of voices, objecting to the Windsor Agreement, to the current arrangements, and the sort of magnetic pull that has over some voters, even though they are no longer a demographic majority. I mean, this is obviously a hugely significant part of the political community, and I think the issue of how you ensure that there's sufficient consent on the unionist side is massive and incredibly difficult, I think, moving forward. Then on the other side of it, which we haven't talked about, I mean, Brexit did, I think, put the constitutional question back on the table, but it doesn't look to me as if there's much enthusiasm except in Sinn Féin south of the border for many politicians to pick it up and run with that. So there's a very strange kind of situation that's resulted at the moment.
Okay, thank you. If there's no more comments on that question, then I've been sent a few almost quick fire questions here. Carwyn, you're being asked, sorry, are you being beckoned aside, or can I? Yeah.
So the dog is barking. My wife's just come in the corner. I said, no, I'm still. This is the peril of being in the kitchen.
You're being
Sorry.
Asked a question about, there's of course all of these electoral reforms now in Wales, and your opinion on that, on the expansion of the number of essays and also the electoral system.
Well, more politicians are never popular. Let's be honest about this. And it's always going to be an uphill battle to persuade people that, in fact, you need more politicians. But what I've said to people is you need to make sure there are enough people to do the job properly. Now, the current Senate has 60 members. I spent most of my time in government. I finished in government in 2018, so I had a couple of years in the back benches. And I literally was on 3 committees a week. And I'd been the first minister. I mean, that would never happen in Westminster. You'd have to have done something very wrong to have to be on that number of committees in a short space of time. But because of the numbers, that was inevitable. I had to recuse myself from a lot of them because I was actually scrutinising what I'd done. So it did come home to me how stretched it is. Bills will go through the Senate with 5 members on the bill committee, and all you need is some members, and that's not at the moment. I don't think they put the work in. All you need is some members who don't turn up, don't bother to put the work in. It puts more strain on the others, and that did happen in the past. So you look at Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's parliament is bigger than the Welsh parliament, even though Northern Ireland is 2/3 the size of Wales. The Scottish parliament is bigger. Scotland is 60% bigger than Wales. It's very good at making itself look bigger. I know that, and I envy that. And Scotland has 129 members. So 96 is, between 80 and 96 is about right, I think, because you need to hold government to account. You need to have that level of scrutiny, although it's an uphill struggle, clearly, to explain this to people, inevitably. The new system, different. I mean, I was never convinced with a system where people were elected in 2 different ways. The reality was that people who were elected on the regional list were never seen by the public as being the equivalent of constituency members. They were, and they were treated that way, and rightly so, but that's not the way the public saw it. And I don't think that was fair, frankly, on them. We now have a system where everyone's elected in the same way. It is more proportional. It does give an opportunity for reform. There's a reason why Nigel Farage is targeting Wales. So reform will win seats in the Senate. So you have to accept that there will be a far broader representation of political views, even some you don't like, and that's part of what the system delivers. The reality is, politically, it would have been impossible to push through a first past the post system with 96 members. That wouldn't have got the majority support or anything close to it in the Senate, and this was the model that attracted the most support. It wasn't supported by all parties. It wasn't supported by the Conservative Party, for example, but this is as close as you can get to a compromise, and it'll be interesting. I'm not saying it'll be comfortable, but it'll be interesting to see what that system throws up in terms of results. Great.
Claire, I think you were a regional MSP before you were a constituency MSP. What do you think about that mixed electoral system?
Having been both, it's much, I would say, I don't know if that's because I represent my hometown and the area where I grew up, that I feel a very personal connection to the voters that you maybe don't get as a regional MSP. I used to think regional MSPs were the MSPs of last resort, so people had been to every other level of representative and then tried the regional MSP. So you sometimes had very, very complicated and difficult situations, but I do think it's hard to maintain a direct link with the electorate in the way that a constituency MSP can. That being said, though, I think as a parliament, the whole idea of proportional representation adds so much to the parliament, and I think it's one of the things we've not talked about reform at Westminster is perhaps there's an opportunity for some sort of proportionate representation there, and for the very reason Carwyn said, we're unicameral Parliament. The committees, which I'm very proud to, yes, the third committee that I've chaired, fourth committee I've chaired in the Parliament, but in this session I've been on the one committee, and we take our responsibilities on that committee and as conveners very, very seriously. So we are scrutinised. I'm scrutinising my own government in terms of their legislation, and it's a very, very important part of what the parliaments do. And I would say that what we've never been able to do is post-legislative scrutiny, the way the likes of the House of Lords committees might look, or the Scotland Committee might look at areas from Westminster. And I do think that's a weakness, and that's down to the volume of work and the numbers as well. But it's a really important part of making good legislation is that cooperative work in the committees, and easier when it is a proportional parliament in that all the parties are there working together. Is really can make a difference.
Okay, well, thank you so much to everybody. We're at the end of our time. I don't know if there are any absolutely final comments, something that I've just not spoken about. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, and wishing you all a very lovely evening.